So I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, my name's Kayleen Harrington, and I've recently joined the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce, looking after their full events programme. So I hope you're enjoying our offering of virtual events. I'm really excited to let you know that we've launched our brand new recovery programme, Virtual Events, which support businesses to restart, rebuild and renew. Our first event is this Friday, the 11th of September at 11 AM, and we'll focus on developing a resilient mindset. I've put a link to this along with our events link in the chat function, so feel free to view this after the webinar and book on any. They're completely free to attend. So, trademarks, copyright, designs and patents are all types of intellectual property IP protection. Having the right type of protection can help you gain value from your ideas, turning inspiration into sustainable business success. In this 45-minute webinar with Peter Golland and Julie Clemenson from Business and IP Centre Norfolk, they'll focus on the 4 key areas of intellectual property and we'll discuss how to recognise your IP and how best to protect it. You're welcome to ask them questions during the presentation. There'll also be a live Q&A afterwards, so please use the Q&A function when you have a question. Julie, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Kayleen. But just to reiterate what Kayleen has said and who we are, Pete and I both work at the Millennium Library, which is the BIPC in Norwich. Just to give you a bit of background, because that's always useful. In October 2017, we formally joined the Business and IP, Intellectual Property, Centre's national network, with the main hub being based in the British Library in London. So a business library, essentially, in the British Library, then spanning out across the country. And we have regional partners across the UK. There's about 12 BIPCs and more coming on board because it's such a good idea. And the IP Business Intellectual Property Centre is just that. That's our unique selling point. And as BIPCs, we get training from the Intellectual Property Office and accreditation in order to give support and guidance on intellectual property to business, entrepreneurs and start-up business. It has to be said that with our training, we are able to do one-to-one sessions for an hour with individuals, which is great. We are not experts, but we do have essential experience and skill in guiding people through the intricacies of intellectual property. We don't get involved so much in legal, the legal aspects of intellectual property, but again, through this webinar, we can say who the people are that could help if there were any infringement of IP that needed to be discussed further. So with this session, Pete's going to start off looking at the elements of intellectual property, then it'll be back to me halfway through to look at the wider picture in terms of how a business might think of commercializing its IP assets. So that's it. So over to Pete and our first slide, Kayleen, please.
Okay, Kayleen, yeah, the first slide, please. Hi to everybody. So hidden value in your business. If you go on to the next one, Kayleen, this is just a general introduction to the Intellectual Property Office that you can contact at any time if you've got any general queries about IP. But if you go on to the next slide, what is intellectual property? It's a broad term used to describe results of creative and innovative endeavours. It's described as intellectual because it's something, an application of your mind. It's described as property because just like any other property, it can be owned, sold, transferred, leased or given away. So there's 4 main types of intellectual property: patents, trademarks, copyright and designs. I'm sure most people have heard of those in general terms, but we're going to explain exactly what each of those are and why they're important to your business. Okay, if you go to the next slide, Kayleen. So IP are the basics. So the first one, if you go to the next slide, is trademarks, okay? Businesses can register a trademark to help protect their brand and use it to identify the names of their products or services. There's a database you can check trademarks to see if your trademark has already been registered. Once you've registered it, you can then sell and license it to other people. You can put the R symbol, little R and a circle symbol next to it to show that it's been registered. And then you can also take legal action against anyone who uses their brand without permission, and that includes people like counterfeiters. You can see on this slide, there's some examples here of famous trademarks you'll probably recognize. So it doesn't have to be just the name. But see the Nike swoosh there is a famous one. Toblerone, you can see bottom right there, registered the actual shape of the chocolate. Simple ones like EasyJet. The bottom left, I think, is Asda. I think they've actually registered 5 people from Yorkshire hitting their backside with their hand, I think. Don't quite know how they did that, but anyway. And then the bottom right is, we think it's the song from McDonald's, Loving It, we believe. With some dispute whether that was the Microsoft jingle or whether it's that one. But anyway, that's the sort of thing you can actually register. So it is quite a broad, a broad range of things. There's a Chartered Institute of Trademark Attorneys who give sort of basic advice, but we can help you do a basic search on that if you've got any sort of questions on that. Get the next slide, please, Kayleen. Okay, so this is copyright. Copyright grants the owner exclusive rights to authorize or prohibit certain uses of their works. It's an automatic right. Everything you write, create, on a day-to-day level does have copyright. You can then control copying the work, distributing copies to the public, adapting, communicating the work to the public, such as broadcasts or putting it on the internet, renting, lending copies to the public, performing it in public. It's an automatic right, so you don't have to register it. That's an important thing to remember. But that also means that you create copyright all the time. Businesses are always doing it every day in their lives. So it's important to sort of understand that and be aware of it, and that you have rights over it, and also not to infringe other people's copyright is very important. So you need to check when you're using images or text that's come from somewhere else, that someone else doesn't own the copyright and that you have permission. The other thing that can be a bit sticky with businesses is third-party copyright, i.e. if you employ someone or you subcontract to someone to create, say, artwork or designs, who owns the copyright? You need to establish that very early on in the process so you know if it's you or the subcontractor who owns it. So it's a straightforward thing, but it's something to bear in mind with your business when you're sort of, starting up. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Designs is the next version of IPR. So this covers everything: appearance, physical shape, configuration, decoration. It protects any aspect of your design, for example, shape, decoration. You can also have it for up to 25 years, so it lasts quite a long time, although you have to keep renewing it. Again, it gives you the right to take legal action against someone who's infringed it or is copying it. Once you've registered, you get a unique registration design number you can put in any of your products. If you're involved in things like design, if you're a designer or a maker of some description, there is an anti-copying in design project which offers really, really good advice to designers. It's rather unfortunately, the acronym is ACID, but it's called Anti-Copying in Design. Again, so it's quite a broad church. There is a database you can actually search to see if it's been used or not. All these databases we use are totally free. Any member of the public can access them to see if their ideas have already been used. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? That regards patents. Now, patents is the most complicated thing. This is really something for inventions and innovation. You can see on this slide, it's a very strange choice of topic here. That is an invisible dog walker, apparently, that picture on the slide. How they managed to get a patent for that, I don't know, because the inventions are supposed to be actually practical, is one of the main things they're supposed to be. Again, it's something that businesses can exploit their patented assets through commercialization. You can take legal action against someone who uses it. You can sell it, you can license it, you can franchise it. Patents is the most complicated. All the other IP, intellectual property, like trademarks, copyright and design, are relatively straightforward to search. You can do that yourself or we can help you and apply for them. Patents is much, much more complicated. You really need specific legal advice from an IP attorney. It's quite an expensive process. It's quite a lengthy process. Only 1 in 20 applicants get a patent without professional help, so it isn't one for the amateur. Again, we can help you do an initial search at the BIPC. We don't go too much in depth because it's such a complicated matter. We do have some links with IP attorney in Norwich who do some pro bono work, so you can often get a free sort of short consultation about your idea. What we try and do is steer people to, a lot of people come out into us and say we have a patent, idea for a patent, and they don't really. It's usually a design or a trademark they're talking about. It's quite a specific thing. There are a Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys. Again, we can refer you to, an individual attorney if that's what you'd like. Can we have the next slide, please? Trade secrets is a slightly tricky one. This is information that is held in a company but isn't really written down or registered in any particular way. You can still legally protect it, but it's a bit more complicated in law. I suppose it applies to things like, I don't know, formulae, algorithms, recipes. I mean, the most famous one is probably Coca-Cola or Kentucky Fried Chicken. I think with Coca-Cola, allegedly, there's only about 4 people who actually know the recipe, and it's not written down anywhere. So I don't quite know how that works as a business model, but that's how they do it, and they keep it as a trade secret. They don't actually register it, so no one else knows about it. It's very much about the law of confidentiality with trade secrets. I just want to mention non-disclosure agreements. It usually scares people, this, but it's quite a straightforward thing in business. You can download templates for NDAs and we can give you some advice on that. It's quite important if you've got any sort of business ideas that you keep it to yourself. Obviously you have to work with other people and interact with other people. But just be careful who you talk to, especially if they're sort of business rivals. And if you're working with other partners or employees, make sure if it's something that is confidential that you do have an NDA in place. It does make things a lot easier. If you get this sort of stuff sorted out early on, it will make everything a lot less complicated later on. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to hand back over to Julie, who's going to talk a little bit more about the practical applications of IP for business. Thanks very much.
Okay, Julie here. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Just to say as well, I'm going to go over some of the same aspects of IP that Pete has introduced. And another important thing to also say is there are notes and fact sheets that we will be providing. So if you forget anything of what we've said, there will be information available. So, yep, the second part of the session is looking at IP and IP in the economy. And the first point, there are some interesting facts here, just to say that in 2016, firms in the UK, the market sector invested an estimate in knowledge assets, of which 63.8 billion was protected by intellectual property rights, which actually equates to 6.8% and 3.2% of the total GDP, the gross domestic product, respectively. So that's a lot of money. That illustrates how much IP and IP assets are actually worth to companies within the UK. The second point on the screen is just to say that SMEs that have filed at least one IPR, an intellectual property right, are actually 21% more likely to experience a subsequent growth period and 10% more likely to become a high grossing firm due to the IP assets within their business. And just ending on a final point, just to say that the likelihood of experiencing a high growth period is 9% higher for SMEs that have filed at least 1%. Can't get, whoops. Sorry, I can't get that to work. Whoops. I can't get that. Whoa. Okay. Thank you. So the likelihood of experience a high growth period is 9% higher for SMEs that have filed at least one patent, and 13% higher for those that have filed at least one trademark. So again, all these specific information and statistics illustrate the importance of IP within business. If we could go to the next slide, please, Kayleen. Thank you. So again, moving on to the importance of IP and IPR, intellectual property rights. So intellectual property represents, as we've said, an important financial and legal asset for companies, including startups. So it's not just established businesses. So for investors, companies with a solid intellectual property portfolio are very much an attractive investment target. The first point that's on the slide, protecting brand, innovation and design of a product or service with intellectual property rights in major markets creates a basis for scaling business quickly and extensively. So something to bear in mind. The second point, which is about identifying and protecting IP, that IP will lock in the value of what makes a business unique, create a barrier to entry for potential competitors, while also giving investors something real to actually invest in, rather than just maybe a good idea. And my third point is ensuring that IP rights are in place early helps to define a clear business strategy and protect against competitors copying your idea, whilst also helping to ensure that you don't inadvertently, as Pete has mentioned, infringe someone else's IP. And as we keep saying, a business who can identify their IP as part of the due diligence is very much likely to look more attractive to an investor. So due diligence meaning care required in terms of knowing about your IP and your IP assets. In addition, however, it should not just be solely about protecting your IP rights, such as trademarks and patents that Pete has mentioned. Very much it's about being aware and about seeking and securing financial opportunities through the means of a strong IP portfolio that forms a fundamental part of a business plan. Next slide, please, Kayleen. Thank you. The next slide is really interesting, again touching on some of the aspects that Pete says in terms of what you could do with your IP, where you can take it to commercialize it. So IP definitely has value, and as with any property, it can be sold, but there are very much other opportunities open to a business who are aware of their IP and who have a very strong IP management and can demonstrate best practice around their IP and can commercialize on their efforts. So yes, once you've identified your IP in your business, you should consider how to manage your IP and the opportunities available to commercialize in order to build up your portfolio and actually a bigger market share. So let's look at franchising. Franchising, most people will have heard of, and it's a good way of sharing IP with others to distribute goods or services. And it means that the franchisor owns the IP rights and the franchisee pays a fee or regular royalties to use them. And examples of a good or of a franchise are McDonald's, and also, which won't surprise many people, but this surprised me, Pitman Training. So the business training organization are part of a franchise, and I was surprised with that. Another way of sharing assets is licensing your IP, and an example of that is by selling a license to your trademark or patent. which presents a financial opportunity to a business while still holding on to your IP assets. Example of this, an IP license would be Microsoft, so a license to use Microsoft products. You can, giving you again another example of what can be done with IP assets, you can actually license just parts of your IP, for instance, registered design, rights on packaging, for instance, as an example, that you've already protected, or you could actually license your IP when you franchise the entire business model, like the McDonald's example. Franchise the entire business model to somebody, then they can replicate your business while you can still maintain control over the standards. And the next point is about investment for growth. So investment for growth, and a business who can identify their IP is likely to look more attractive to an investor and can help to collaborate with confidence. Yep. So, and there's one last point at the bottom there. Okay. We're going to look at tools later on, but a good tool, an online tool, and we mentioned the IPO, which is the Intellectual Property Office based in Newport, and they have an online resource called IP for Investment, which identifying your IP and your IP assets within a business is a very skilled thing to do. But as for a starter for 10, using the IP for Investment tool, online tool, can at least give you a bit of a flavour of the areas that you should be looking at in terms of your intangible assets in an IP context and the overall business strategy, and help you to understand how these assets relate to a business growth. Could we have a look at the next slide, please, Kayleen? Thank you. So getting it right for your business. As we said, it's not just about protecting parts of your business through the intellectual property rights. It's about seeing IP as an integral part of a business and the overall business strategy. So we've, Pete has mentioned NDAs, non-disclosure, so using confidentiality agreements, so you protect rights within your business. We've also mentioned considering trade secrets, yes, and non-disclosure agreements to keep everything protected, and then documenting your IP within your business plan, and I guess continually updating your business plan and with your IP rights. And due diligence meaning required carefulness. There are a lot of areas to think about in terms of due diligence, but just going over a few of the main areas, as Pete has mentioned, and me, keeping your ideas and your inventions secret is very important. Check if you're at the beginning of your business journey, you need to check if your brand is already registered as a trademark. Another area important to realise is within a business, within a supply chain, that you're not actually using counterfeit products. So they don't exist within your supply chain. Make sure you know who owns the IP within the business, and especially if there are sort of separate agreements, confidentiality agreements, if there is a third party involved in any aspect of your business. And then seek professional help and advice if applying for a patent. And IP attorneys, yeah, you can go down the route, as Pete has mentioned, in embarking the assistance of an IP attorney. Quite often, IP attorneys specialise in specific areas. I know with one of our delegates today mentioning whether it was banking or IT assets, but you will find that there are attorneys who specialise in the different areas, different market sectors, so that you get the advice and help you need with your product or your service. Okay. As I said, if you outsource parts of your business activities, have contracts in place that ensure that your IP rights remain with you. And if you plan to trade abroad, make sure you have the correct IP protection in those countries and those territories as well. Okay. And lastly there, if your business uses computer systems or software, as we've said, check you have the right licenses. And make sure you're entitled to use other people's work. That can't be stressed enough. Lovely. If we want to go to the next slide, which again, valuing your IP. Like other forms of property, you can buy, sell and license IP, and it's important you understand the value of your trademark, your patent or design. You may also need to know the value of your IP assets when seeking funding for joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions, or during bankruptcy. So again, it's just knowing the total value of your tangible assets, and IP would be considered the intangible assets. A couple of questions to throw out there which kind of highlights these points is areas to consider. So how much is your brand name worth maybe after years of marketing? Does your patent protect your product, or is it redundant? Which those kind of questions will help you kind of to realize the value of your intangible assets. And as I've said before and put up on this slide, there are a number of resources available which can help navigate how you may start to consider what the value is within your IP assets. I've put up here on the screen the website. There is more than one way actually of looking at the valuation of your IP within a business, but the Government UK site is obviously a credible site in order to get a kind of an idea of different ways to look at your business to do the valuation. As it says at the bottom, not all IP is valuable, which maybe links in with that earlier question to do with does your patent protect your product, or has it now been redundant? Has an invention been superseded by something else? But just to remember that there is help out there to look at the valuation side in lots of different forms. Okay, if we look at the next slide, which again is sort of segues into the tools of assessing and also understanding IP. As an accredited advisor, a lot of us start with looking at the IP basics, which is mentioned on this screen. Again, it's a tool, an online tool, as well as in book form, that comes from the IPO Direct, the Intellectual Property Office, and it gives a really good grounding on all the different aspects of intellectual property, and the interactive tool is really good. Talking about the Intellectual Property Office, they are very keen on raising their profile. As we've discovered with our one-to-one sessions, a lot of people who are maybe starting out in business or we see a lot of creatives as well, whether that's to do with literature, publication or makers, and for them IP can be something almost like unknown territory, and so as well as coming into the library on a one-to-one session to discuss IP, there are the tools out there for having a look at what the IP basics. The IP in Wales, a quick telephone call to run ideas past them. They'll usually chat to you for about 10 minutes with whether it's to look at patents or other aspects of IP, and they can guide you through that. And then the other tool is the IP Equip, which is mentioned here, and then the IP health check. And again, it does what it says on the tin there, covering those various different aspects of intellectual property, but all written in a really clear and jargon-free way. So hopefully that gives you confidence in dipping into the world of IP and not seeing it so much as a barrier. Yeah, and as I said, the Intellectual Property Office are doing more and more to raise their profile. They have put lots of videos online as well, which can be accessed via YouTube, and they are very keen just to have a chat. Okay, I think there might be another slide, Kayleen. Thank you. So again, this is just business and IP support, putting it out there again, the various organisations that we've mentioned. We are a UK patent library. By holding our one-to-one sessions and resources that we have available, and as well as being part of the business and intellectual property centres, and we also have support from via the growth hubs and the LEP as well, doing sessions at the BIPC. Lots of other ideas out there to do with seminars and events that are always available, IPO blogs, and also thinking about international trade. There is the IPO website and also European IPO. Okay, would you like to go on to the next, or the next slide might be linking in with questions, Kayleen, and coming back to you.
Thank you. Oh, I've never been so tense trying to operate your presentation.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I hope I did you both justice.
Big responsibility.
Yeah, you certainly did. The fact that somebody's just knocked on my door has made me very tense as well. Sorry, everybody.
That's fine. It's always the way, isn't it?
Yes.
Right, so we have got a couple of questions. Also, feel free, if you have any questions, to pop them in the Q&A function. So bear with me. One question. Oh, sorry. So one question we've received, and I don't know who out of the two of you would like to answer it, is how do you protect your IP if you're up against a big corporate that is trying to take your product name?
Okay. Pete, do you want me to do that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it is a tricky one because, you know, one of the criticisms of the intellectual property system is it does seem to be a little bit skewed in favour of the big boys. That is a general sort of issue, but there are things you can do. I know, Jules, you've been doing some research on this, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I had a good look at this, and one thing when we did the training at the IP office in Wales, they but this isn't so much for the big boys. You know, they were very keen on if there was any kind of infringement mediation. So rather than it getting to a law court, the two parties involved, maybe with the help of the IPO, the Intellectual Property Office, sat down and discussed where the issues were to try and work it out. And if anything, I suppose even if you were taking on the big boys, the fact that you'd sort of got in contact, offered to mediate before things were if they were indeed taken further, sort of shows that you're serious and you know and that you understand about the rights, your intellectual property rights, and want to protect it. So in some ways, if you do go after the big boys, I think however you did that, but mainly with the mediation, it might just help swing things in your favor. Because I do remember with the training, and I can't remember the exact example, Pete might remember, but we did discuss where that very much happened. You know, there had been something, and then with a small operator, they did go after the big boys, and
Yeah.
they won. You know, have just helped oil the wheels.
And also, I think it also demonstrates the importance of, you know, knowing what your IP is and having it all registered and locked down before you start, doesn't it,
Yeah.
Jules? Because
Yeah.
you know, then you're on safe ground there. You know, if you do have to take legal action, you're on safe ground because you know what you've got and you've had it properly registered.
Perfect, thank you. Also, if anyone wants to ask a question, then let me know and I'll give you, I'll access you audio rights. Just pop in the chat function or the Q&A if you're interested in asking a question, that's not a problem. So we have received another question, and again, I'm not directing this at anyone in particular. What's the cost to register / protect your IP in Europe? And how will this be affected post-January 2020? I mean, 2021?
Yeah.
What a great question.
Yeah, they are great. They are great questions, and they're not, it's something that's on everybody's lips at the moment, but at the same time, we're all kind of been involved in dealing with different things because of the pandemic. So I think our eyes gone off the ball there. But I did give the IPO a bit of a ring, and they did say that essentially, and I'm going to have to look at my notes because it was quite a sort of complicated kind of area. So to do with charges, trademarking in Europe, they were very specific about that. Trademarks, they said, came to a fee of 150 euros initially, and then if with trademarking, because that's all dependent on classification areas, Kayleen, and the questioner, but if you then sort of had additional areas that you wanted to possibly sell in, venture in, offer a service in, there are additional an extra £50 in the further classification sections. So that kind of answered that question. And again, registered design rights in Europe, I think the guy said 150 euros to secure that, but for patents it wasn't as clear cut, and I'm sorry everybody, but to do with the charges, yeah, that wasn't really clear cut because it depended on the countries and the area of trading that you were going to get involved in, so that had to be maybe looked at separately. Yes, so that will have to be looked at separately. But to do with then going forward and post 2021, patents, the registrar said there wouldn't be any change, but for registered design and trademarks, he was talking about like a transitional period to do with anything that had been agreed in the European areas. Those rights would cease, and then things would have to be applied for British or UK rights in terms of registered design and trademarks, or comparable rights been given. So comparisons. So that are the areas, I believe, where the IPO are going in terms of post 2021, but it could all change. So they were a bit sketchy, but so I also will be keeping very close a watch on what happens and what's on the website of the IPO. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
It's all a bit up in the air at the moment, isn't it? It's all a bit up in the air at the moment, Jules, isn't it? I think it's all up for grabs at the moment. I mean, we've got a fact sheet on the current UK charges that are applicable, but I think we're reluctant to do a European one because it was changed quite a lot anyway. But I think any questions like that, you can always contact the Intellectual Property Office directly, and they can give you a current assessment of what's happening with the charges, I think.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I'm conscious that we've not got long left, and hang on one second. I was about to say we haven't got any more questions, but we have. So if you have a gap, as Julie just said, doesn't that open a window when someone could take your patent, etc.?
I would have thought, even no, I don't know. I wouldn't have thought the IPO would have allowed that, to be perfectly frank. I mean, as I say,
No, I don't think
we
so. I
don't
think
get
it'll be a seamless. It'll be seamless
Yeah.
from one system to another. It won't be any overlap, so there won't be any gaps.
Perfect. Well, I think we've answered all the questions, not me, you.
It was the wording they used that gave
Whatever happens,
the transitional period. That was actually
if
their
they have to
wording, not
extend the
mine.
current
But
arrangements.
I'm sure they will have it nailed down. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I believe we've answered all the questions. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. As Julie mentioned, I will be sharing after the presentation some handouts and fact sheets along with contact details. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact either Peter or Julie and they'll be more than happy to assist. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. I don't know if Peter and Julie, you just want to say a final farewell?
Again,
Goodbye to everyone, and say you can always come and book a one-to-one session with us direct at the BIPC. Our email address is at the end of the slideshow.
Yeah. And just to add as well, yeah, great to meet everybody, but also just to say I've sent an overview fact sheet as well, because even though the second floor isn't open within the Millennium Library where we're based, you can get hold of us by our dedicated BIPC email address. So have a look at the overview, and we look forward to maybe seeing you on a one-to-one session, on an IP one-to-one session.
Perfect. Well, thank you, and
Thanks.
hopefully we'll
Bye-bye.
see you on one of our future events, virtual events as well. See you later.
Thank you, Kayleen.
Bye.
Bye.